A guide to growing tomatoes. Tomatoes are probably the most popular garden vegetable grown in North America. And yet, how to home grow them still remains a mystery for many. I'll give you the know-how you need to transform into a tomato growing expert. Want to know how to select the right tomato variety? Let us help. There are over 700 tomato varieties available, so choosing the right tomato seeds can feel like a daunting task. Should you get red, yellow, orange, or maybe even purple? Do you want to grow tomatoes that are tiny and sweet or big as a melon? Juicy or plumpy? So many decisions. First, it is worth considering what the tomatoes will ultimately be used for. That being said, there are a few things to consider when choosing the right type of tomato. The first thing to consider is plant size. Some little seeds can grow into very large garden companions. So if there isn't much room for growing, then it might be best to grow smaller varieties. Small. Cherry tomatoes can easily be grown in a planter. There are even dwarf varieties, which can be grown in pots as small as 6 inches, 15 centimeters deep, making them ideal on a sunny windowsill. These smaller growing options won't be found with slicing tomatoes or pasta sauce-loving varieties, so available space may make the final decision. Medium. Determinate tomatoes grow to about 2 to 3 feet, 60 to 91 centimeters tall, need little to no pruning, can be supported with simple stakes, and are an excellent choice for containers and large pots. Determinate tomatoes have a growth habit of setting fruit and then concentrating on ripening all that fruit in one large wave. Most varieties of paste tomatoes are determinate because most of the fruit ripens within 2 or 3 weeks. Determinate varieties are also good for cold climate gardeners who need to harvest their whole crop within a couple of weeks. Large. Indeterminate, also known as vining tomatoes, can get very large, some growing up to 10 feet, 305 centimeters tall, with 6 feet, 183 centimeters being about the average. These are not optimal if the gardening space is at a premium, as they don't thrive in a pot or planter like some of the other options. The growth habit of indeterminate plants is to keep growing taller and taller, setting and ripening fruit as they grow until the plants are killed by frost. These varieties require more cage and stake support, as well as more attention. So, if there is plenty of space, the preference is to pick tomatoes over several months, and sturdy support can be provided with stakes, cages, or ladders. Then an indeterminate variety may be a perfect one to grow. Most beefsteak tomatoes are indeterminate, but there are also lots of cherry tomatoes and other varieties in this style of plant. The next thing to consider is disease resistance. Tomatoes are susceptible to a number of diseases that may or may not be common in your region. These diseases can weaken the plant and reduce yields, so look at the seed packet or plant label to see if the variety has resistance to those which are common in your area. For example, verticillium and fusarium wilt are 2 very common soil-borne diseases that affect tomatoes. So seeds with resistance to these diseases are designated by a V or F after the variety name. Check the tomato seeds for which diseases they are resistant to. Here's how to get tomato plants started. Tomato seeds are almost always started indoors, whether in a greenhouse or on a sunny window ledge, and are then transplanted to beds once they have at least a few leaves and an established root system. Starting seeds indoors is ideal, as tomato seeds need a constant soil temperature of at least 60 degrees Fahrenheit, 15.5 degrees Celsius, and preferably 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 26.5 degrees Celsius to germinate. So, in temperate climates, it may be midsummer before the soil gets that warm, and by then it's too late for tomatoes to grow and mature before the end of the growing season. Therefore, it's best to start tomatoes inside. Ready to prepare containers and the growing medium? Here's how. Seeds can be started in just about anything that holds soil and has drainage holes. A paper egg carton with holes poked in the bottoms is a great option. That being said, purchased containers like biodegradable pots and seed starting trays are also great to use. When it comes to the best kind of soil for planting seeds, it is super important to know to always avoid using garden soil if possible. Garden soil often drains poorly and may harbor disease organisms. The best growing medium for starting tomato seeds actually has no soil in it at all. Instead, choose a sterile, soilless mix that's labeled as being specifically for seed starting. Here's a step-by-step guide to planting tomato seeds. Step 1. First, thoroughly dampen the seed starting mix before putting it into the container. Once the medium is nice and moist, fill the containers to within half an inch, 1 centimeter of the top. Pat the medium down nicely into the container, but try not to pack it down too firmly. It should still be workable and loose for the soon-to-grow rooting system. Step 2. Place 2 or 3 seeds into each container and then cover the seeds with about a 1/4 inch, 6.5 millimeters of soil. Lightly tap down the seed starting medium over the seeds to gently tuck them into their new homes. To ensure there's good seed to mix contact, it's really helpful to water them after seeding. Ideally, use a plant mister or just dribble a light stream of water over the top. The whole soil shouldn't be soaked, just moisten the top layer. A mister is fantastic to use as it moistens the mix without disturbing the surface or the seed. Step 3. Place the pots in a warm spot, or ideally on top of a heat mat. A great little trick is to place the tray on top of the refrigerator since it's surprisingly warm. The seeds will love it. At this point, the seeds don't need light, and they won't take up too much space either. Step 4. For the next few weeks, try to keep the mix moist but not soaked. A greenhouse top helps hold some of the moisture in. However, the same results can be achieved by layering some plastic wrap over the top. As soon as sprouts are visible, remove the covering and place the container in a sunny window or under grow lights. The seeds sprout quite quickly, so be sure to check the containers daily to be safe. Continue to keep the soil moist but not saturated. Since dry seed starting mix usually turns a lighter color when it dries out, which is a good indication that the sprouting tomato seedlings need water. Now let's take a look at some useful tips for growing strong tomato seedlings. Once the seedlings start popping up, do everything possible to help them become as strong and hardy as possible. Here are some great tips for this stage of the growth cycle. Tip 1. Put a fan on it. Tomato plants need to move and sway in the breeze to develop strong stems. That happens naturally outdoors, but when starting seeds indoors, they'll need some type of air circulation to do this. Create a breeze by turning a fan on the seedlings for 5 to 10 minutes twice a day. Tip 2. When growing plants on a windowsill, rotate the plants daily so that the plants grow upright instead of leaning toward the light. Tip 3. When growing seedlings under lights, raise the lights as the plants grow, keeping them just a few inches above the plants at all times. Tip 4. Watering seedlings from below helps to avoid disturbing the seeds and compacting the soil, which is what tends to happen when watering from above. To water from below, simply place the sprouting tray or container onto a tray of water. Make sure that the bottom of the sprouting tray or container is slightly submerged, but don't let the water go above the top of the planter, as the goal is to simply allow the soil and roots to absorb the water they need through the drainage holes at the bottom of the container. If watering from below isn't possible, use a mister to dampen the soil, rather than pouring water on the surface directly. Tip 5. Insufficient light can lead to weak, spindly plants. An adjustable grow light really is ideal. However, if one isn't available, A makeshift light box can be made by placing a sheet of reflective tinfoil along the seed tray on the side opposite the window. This will reflect daylight onto the darker side of the plant. Here's how to move growing seedlings to bigger pots. If tomatoes outgrow their starter pots before it's time for them to be planted outdoors, it's a good idea to replant them into larger containers. New, larger containers are also a good idea when plants' true leaves first appear. The key is always to avoid letting seedlings become pot-bound, which means that they've got to a point where their roots completely fill the container. This is something to avoid, as it can stunt the plant's growth. Either way, after the seedlings' first true leaves grow, transplant them into individual small pots so that the seed leaves are just above the soil level. As a general rule, a plant should be replanted at the same depth it was growing initially. It's also helpful to add a little of the seed's compost into the mixture when transplanting them into their individual pots. When transplanting, use a small utensil, like a table knife, to help lift the transplants out of their original pots. It's helpful to hold seedlings by their leaves rather than by their stems to avoid crushing the delicate stem tissues. A 4-inch, 10-centimeter diameter pot that is 3 to 4 inches, 7.5 to 10 centimeters deep is usually adequate. Though it can be tempting to transplant them right into the garden, try to avoid moving them into the garden until after the area's average late frost date. Even then, be prepared to protect seedlings with season-extending garden fabric, row covers, or plant covers if a late frost comes around. Ready to discover the right way to fertilize tomatoes? At this stage, it's important not to fertilize too much too soon. Giving tomato seedlings too much fertilizer too early in the growth cycle can actually reduce their root growth. Overfeeding young plants may cause root burn too. A half dose of water-soluble fertilizer usually works nicely. Keep in mind that tomato food is usually not given to soil-grown plants until they reach the flowering or fruiting stage, around 3 months after sowing, depending on the variety. Now let's talk thinning. For the strongest, healthiest plants, there should be just one seedling per pot or container. Removing excess tomato seedlings enables each plant to get the sufficient space, sunlight, and nutrients that they need to grow. Select the strongest, healthiest seedlings, and use a pair of scissors to snip off the others at the soil line. It may be possible to transplant the extras into different pots, but there is the risk of disturbing the roots of the remaining plant. Tomato plants are usually ready for thinning about 2 to 3 weeks after sprouting, or when they're approximately 3 to 4 inches, 7.5 to 10 centimeters high. When choosing which seedlings to leave, a good rule of thumb is to keep the larger, more developed ones. As in nature, it's survival of the fittest. Before transplanting tomato seedlings outside, they need to be hardened off first, in order to give the plants time to adjust to the potentially lower temperatures, increased breeze, and higher light levels. Tomato plants are easily stressed, so getting them used to outside conditions gradually, over a period of a week or so, helps keep them happy and growing at a consistent rate. Simply leave seedlings out longer each day, and later in the evening to experience the drop in temperature. After a week or two of this, they should be able to cope outside overnight, if temperatures are favorable. Keep in mind that when hardening off tomato plants, this isn't just against the cold. Direct sunlight on seedlings and young plants for several hours can be as harmful as frost. When growing tomatoes on the patio, it's important to choose varieties that are suitable for outdoor growing and that mature early. If they're being grown in a container, keep stability in mind when growing bush varieties in large pots. On a windy day, pots are easily blown over, so choosing pots with a solid, wide base can help. Large pots and containers are ideal for growing bush varieties, which can trail over the sides. When using a grow bag as their final destination, it helps to keep the plants in their pots, then plant the pots right into the grow bag. The roots will grow through the holes in the bottom of the pots and into the grow bag. This also helps stop the grow bag from drying out too quickly, as less compost is exposed. It also enables the taproot to go down in search of water, and the finer roots around the base of the stem are then able to absorb nutrients. Feeding is done by applying diluted nutrients around the bottom of the stems where the fine roots grow. It's time to discover the importance of using support structures for tomatoes. If left to their own devices, tomatoes tend to become more prone to disease, and the fruit quality and quantity can suffer. So, using a support system that lifts plants off the ground and allows for air circulation can help grow a bigger and tastier crop. Before looking at the support structure options, there are a few things to consider before choosing the best solution for your garden. For example, how much room is available? For small garden spaces, it will be better to choose a compact solution, like a cage and ladder. These provide a narrower footprint than other support options, and they are stackable when it's time to store them. Another consideration is which type of tomato plants are being grown, determinate or indeterminate. Indeterminate varieties need a taller support. Determinate varieties can often get by with something smaller. Will the suckers be pruned off the plants to reduce foliage? If so, give ladders, weaves, or tripods a try. If the preference is to let the plants grow wild and free, a cage-style support might work best. Here are the support structure options for tomatoes. Cages and ladders. Cylindrical or square wire cages are the most common way to keep tomatoes upright if you want to avoid tying stems. Instead, the walls of the cage are used to support the leaves and stems. Something to keep in mind, though, is that although they are easy, they're often not big enough for indeterminate varieties. A quick fix for that is to make larger cages using 10-gauge concrete reinforcement wire with 6-inch openings, available at almost any home improvement store. Then cut a 4¼ foot, 130 centimeters length of the wire and coil it to make a circular cage that's about 18 inches, 45 centimeters wide in diameter. Snipping off the bottom 2 levels of horizontal wires will help create legs, which can be pushed into the ground in order to hold the cage in place. Plant 1 tomato inside the cage and then simply pull the stems through the wire for support as they grow. Florida weave and trellis. Often used commercially for determinate varieties, this training technique supports tomatoes with twine that's woven horizontally between rows of stakes. This makes cleanup a dream at the end of the season, as string at the end can be snipped and the plants can be composted. For this technique, tomato transplants, at the seedling stage, get planted about 2 feet apart in single rows within raised beds. Drive a stake into the soil at each end of the row and between each plant in the row. When the transplants are roughly about a foot, 30 centimeters high, tie twine to the first stake at about 6 inches, 15 centimeters high, and loop it around the next stake at the same height. Make a double loop around the last stake for strength, and loop your way down the opposite side of the bed, keeping tension on the line all the way down. When you get back to the first stake, tie off and cut the twine. Depending on how fast the plants grow and how heavy they get, you'll need to run another line of twine about 6 inches higher every week or so in order to keep supporting the tomato plants. Stakes. To use this solution, grab stakes, hammer them into the ground, and grow. Make sure that the stake is at least 6 feet, 182 centimeters tall when measured from the ground for indeterminate plant varieties. As the plant grows, tie the stems loosely to the stakes with fabric strips, twine, or zip ties. Metal rebar stakes are often better to use, as wooden stakes can shatter, splinter, or rot if stored outdoors. Plus, rebar's smaller diameter, 3/8 of an inch, just under 1 centimeter, is easier to get into the ground, especially if the soil is moistened. Tripods. These take a little longer to build, but they are really pretty once up, and they're incredibly durable. Fastening 3 stakes into a tripod provides extra stability for plants located in a windy region. This is especially true once a plant has been trained to wind up the stake, as the weight of the plant helps further anchor the tripod to the ground. To help the process, wrap a nice long string of twine loosely around the outside of the tripod to act as a trellis. Just tie it at the top and then spiral it down approximately every 6 inches, 15 centimeters, and then simply tie the other end of the string to the base. It makes training the plant so much easier. Pruning is so helpful for tomato plants because it helps keep tomato plants compact, makes it easy to use supporting methods like ladders. It maximizes tomato production by helping the plant focus on fruit development, and it minimizes disease problems by improving air circulation. But moderation is key, as too much pruning can also remove leaves that would otherwise feed the plant. The reduction of foliage can also expose fruit to the sun, which may result in the equivalent of a sunburn, aka not good. Pruning consists of pinching off suckers, the tiny stems that pop out where side branches meet the main stem. A good way of maintaining moderation in pruning is to remove suckers that grow below the first flower cluster. This keeps the main stem strong while also retaining upper suckers that will eventually produce flowers and fruit. Leaving plenty of foliage on also helps to reduce the risk of sun scalding in areas with intense summer sun. On the other hand, some gardeners who live in regions with short growing seasons prefer to start pruning off suckers in late summer in order to encourage the plant to direct its energy to existing fruit. Those gardeners using cages or towers to support their plants often only pinch suckers from the lower stems, allowing the ones higher up to grow. If space is at a premium, or if ladders, stakes, or other tall, narrow supports are being used, try pruning tomatoes to 1 or 2 main stems by pinching off all suckers. Otherwise, they will grow into additional stems and create a wide, bushy plant. If all the suckers are pruned, then the stems left standing will grow strong and will be easier to tie to the supports. Removing lower leaves can help with air circulation around the base of the plants, as can removing old decaying leaves in order to discourage bugs and diseases. As lower leaves, below the first truss, start yellowing, remove them as you would side shoots. The truss on a tomato plant is a group or cluster of smaller stems where flowers and fruit develop. In general, leaves can usually be removed gradually, up to the first truss, then above the first truss after it's producing ripe tomatoes, usually emerging at or near the point where a primary stem meets a secondary or a leaf stem. Trusses produce yellow flowers from whose centers small green tomatoes eventually appear. Keep in mind that de-leafing a plant too quickly and removing too many leaves can result in a poorer harvest, so slow and respectful is key. Tomatoes need a steady and moderate diet of water and nutrients. It's helpful to stay away from high nitrogen fertilizers like ammonium sulfate or fresh manure, because it can be easy to overuse them. Over-fertilizing can result in tall plants with few tomatoes. Before starting on fertilizing, it's really helpful to first test the soil. If the soil is balanced or high in nitrogen, use a fertilizer that is slightly lower in nitrogen and higher in phosphorus, such as a 5-to-10-to-5 or a 5-to-10-to-10 mixed fertilizer. Although organic fertilizers such as bone meal, dried manure, or cottonseed meal are amazing, it's good to remember that most organic fertilizers don't naturally offer a balance of the three major nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. For example, with dried manure, it tends to be low in phosphorus, so you consider adding some bone meal at the same time to give it a healthier balance. Mixing things up in order to create a perfect balance is the way to go. Next, when to fertilize is just as important as what is used and how much is added. A typical time to start feeding tomato plants is when the first tomatoes have just formed. And after this point, it helps to continue to add fertilizer approximately every 3 to 4 weeks. We recommend using 1.5 tablespoons of a 5 to 10 to 10 solution per plant. Draw a 1-inch, 2.5 centimeter deep trench around the plant, making sure that the circumference of the trench is about 5 to 6 inches, 12 to 15 centimeters away from the stem all the way around for the fertilizer to go into. Try not to get any of this fertilizer on the leaves or stem, as it can burn the plant. Then cover the fertilizer with soil. Rain and a watering routine will help in carrying those nutrients down to the plant's roots. Aim for slow-release formulas that gradually break down in the soil to provide a continuous source of nutrition. The better the soil, the better the plants will grow. Building the soil up nutritionally, rather than simply adding a chemical quick fix, is the best plan for the long run. As for mulch, it helps to make an organic layer of leaves, hay, coconut husk, wood pieces, or pine cone pieces to tomato plants. It decays over time and provides a continuous source of additional nourishment. In addition to this, placing mulch on the soil around the plant also aids in water retention and increases room for aeration if it's lightly mixed with the topsoil. The biggest and most immediate impact of using mulch relates to watering, as mulching can significantly reduce the rate of water that evaporates from the soil. Aphids. These tiny pests come in a variety of colors: green, black, red, light orange, or yellow, and mainly feed on the undersides of leaves and stems. What they're actually feeding on is the sap in plants, which ends up causing the plants damage. Aphids also leave behind a sticky substance called honeydew, and they are a pest that's known to spread diseases. Aphids can be tolerated by most plants when their numbers are low, but if there's a lot of aphids, they can stunt a plant's growth and cause a plant's leaves to turn yellow and fall off. Here's what to do. For the most part, plants can handle mild aphid infestations. But if they're found, a strong jet of water from a garden hose will wash them off the plants. Spraying plants with water should be done early in the morning so that the plants can dry off during the day. Sticky traps, neem oil, insecticidal soaps, and horticultural oils are also effective against aphids. Just be sure to follow the application instructions on the packaging. Oftentimes, you can also get rid of aphids by wiping or spraying the leaves with a mild solution of water and a few drops of dish soap. One variation includes adding a pinch of cayenne pepper. Soapy water should be reapplied every 2 to 3 days for about 2 weeks. As well, you can try to attract beneficial insects like lady beetles, hoverflies, and lacewings, all of which are important aphid predators. Make sure to check all transplants for aphids before planting. And keep in mind that aphids aren't very mobile, so it's not uncommon to find one heavily affected plant surrounded by plants that are fine. If this is the case, simply remove and destroy the infected plant. Slugs and snails. These slimy pests are either hard-shelled or soft, and they are nocturnal creatures who feed on the leaves and stems of a plant during the night. The feeding damage from these pests leaves irregular-shaped holes behind. Leaves can also be shredded or eaten entirely, and there will also be slime trails on nearby rocks, plants, and walkways. These pests thrive in damp conditions, damage a plant's growth, and also affect a plant's ability to form roots. Here's what to do. Wet conditions encourage slugs and snails. So, although it's important to keep the soil moist, it's just as important not to overwater any plants. As well, avoid overhead watering and keep any organic waste away from plants. If possible, hand-pick any slugs or snails at night, which is when those pests are most active. Beer traps are another way to handle a snail or slug problem. For this, dig a hole in the ground and place a large cup or bowl into the hole. It's best to use something with steep sides so that the slugs can't crawl back out when they're done, like a mason jar. Fill the jar about half full with beer and let it sit overnight. In the morning, the jar should then be full of drowned slugs that can then be flushed down the toilet. Another option is to place a barrier of diatomaceous earth, a natural powder made up of the skeletons of tiny aquatic creatures, around plants to keep snails and slugs away. Spider mites. These tiny, spider-like pests are about the size of a grain of pepper and can be red, black, brown, or yellow in color. They feed on plants, sucking on the plant juices and removing chlorophyll, which is important for a plant's ability to turn sunlight into energy. Then, the mites inject toxins into the plants, which causes white dots to appear. Also, affected leaves will become dry and yellow, and those affected leaves can drop from the plant entirely. Oftentimes, there's also some webbing visible on the plant, and the plant's growth can be slowed. Typically, spider mites multiply quickly and thrive in dry and dusty conditions. Here's what to do. Monitor plants for signs of spider mites, paying close attention to the undersides of leaves. Spider mites can sometimes be controlled with a forceful spray of water every other day, and it's best to spray them in the morning hours. That's because when plants are sprayed early in the day, those plants have time to dry off, which avoids bacterial or fungal growth from taking place. Hot pepper wax or insecticidal soap can also get rid of spider mites. Just be mindful that certain sprays can also kill off the natural predators of spider mites. Since these natural predators, like ladybugs, are good bugs to have, they should be encouraged in the garden. Hornworm's caterpillar. This is a green caterpillar that's typically 2 inches, 5 centimeters long. They love to snack on the edges of leaves. Here's what to do. Pluck off caterpillars and drown them in soapy water. Make sure to look at the caterpillars carefully, because if they have white, knobby growths, then the bugs should be left alone. Those little white growths are actually eggs laid in the caterpillar's flesh by a parasitic wasp, which are helpful for tomatoes. Those eggs will hatch, and baby wasps will eventually eat the caterpillars, as well as other pests. Blossom end rot. When plants are affected with this disease, light brown spots will first appear at the bottom of the fruit, and those fruits will often get invaded by another black mold. As the fruit grows, the spots grow bigger, turning into dark, leathery lesions that are sunken into the fruit. Here's what to do. Maintain consistent watering and keep the soil evenly moist. Also, add mulch to help the plants retain water. Straw or black plastic will do the trick. Excess nitrogen also causes blossom end rot on crops because the excess nitrogen blocks the absorption of calcium. As a result, it's best to avoid high nitrogen fertilizers as well as ammonia fertilizers, like fresh manure. If a plant is already showing signs of end rot in the plant's early fruiting phase, calcium may need to be added into the soil. Keep in mind, though, that calcium isn't taken in well by the leaves, so avoid using a foliar spray. Calcium needs to go directly to the roots, so calcium carbonate tablets, or anti-acid tablets like Tums, can be placed into the soil at the base of the plant. Late blight. Black spots that look like peppercorns will appear as though they're embedded in the leaves of infected plants. Late blight becomes a problem when heavy rainfall and dense leaf canopies keep plants from drying properly. Here's what to do. Avoid late blight by planting disease-free seeds, and make sure that plants are spaced out properly so that the plant leaves can dry out. If the disease is already present, be sure to remove and destroy any infected plants to keep the late blight from spreading. Some helpful tips for harvesting and storing tomatoes include: Tip 1. When the average daytime temperatures are consistently below 65 degrees Fahrenheit, 18.3 degrees Celsius, it is time to pick the tomatoes and bring all maturing fruits indoors, either on the vine or off. Tip 2. Leave tomatoes on the vine as long as possible. But if any fall off before they appear ripe, place them in a paper bag with the stem up and store them in a cool, dark place. A cupboard, paper bag, or between sheets of newspaper, for example, are fantastic places to ripen tomatoes indoors. Tip 3. Tomatoes usually ripen indoors in approximately 2 weeks. To speed up the process, put a ripe banana or a cut-open apple in a bag with green tomatoes. Both emit lots of ethylene gas, which result in quicker ripening. Tip 4. Tomatoes need oxygen to ripen, so don't seal them up in a plastic bag or Tupperware. Tip 5. It's best to cut tomatoes off the vine with scissors or hand pruners, leaving a short stub of stem attached. Otherwise, the area around the scar at the top may rot before the tomatoes can be eaten. Tip 6. Avoid placing tomatoes on a sunny windowsill to ripen. They may rot before they are ripe. Tip 7. The perfect tomato for picking will be firm and very red in color, regardless of size, with perhaps some yellow remaining around the stem. When growing orange, yellow, or any other colored tomato, wait for the tomato to turn the correct color. Tip 8. If the tomato plant still has fruit when the first hard frost threatens, pull up the entire plant and hang it upside down in the basement or garage. Pick the tomatoes as they ripen. Tip 9. Never refrigerate fresh tomatoes. Doing so spoils the flavor and texture that make up that garden tomato taste. And definitely don't try to ripen them in the fridge, since tomatoes won't ripen in temperatures below 65 degrees Fahrenheit, 18.3 degrees Celsius. Tip 10. To preserve the harvest longer, try canning, freezing, or drying. Canning can preserve tomatoes for around a year. Frozen tomatoes can usually be used for up to 8 months. And dried tomatoes typically can keep for about a year as well,